Welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined today by a guest. 801 Bracketology is joining the show to talk everything leading up to Selection Sunday. 801 is the 13th ranked bracketologist in the bracket matrix, where there's like 200 or more people. So that's pretty impressive. 98.5% or better accuracy for 4 straight years. So very credible source here, and I'm excited. Today we're going to talk, like I said, about the upcoming bracket, and let's start nowhere else but the top 16 here. So CBS released what the committee would have if the season ended on last Saturday, February 15th. This was before all the games, but there shouldn't be too much shuffling, at least at the very top, as a result of the Saturday and Sunday games. My first question is very simple. Like, what stands out here? Were there any inconsistencies with what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think you make some great comments. One of the things that was interesting that they mentioned in the bracket preview, specifically regarding Auburn and Alabama, was that they didn't think that one game could make a difference if Alabama had beat Auburn on Saturday. And so just like you said, there's probably not much shuffling that's happened just based off of one game on Saturday from what the top 16 was when it was announced. I do have a couple of changes since the top 16 was announced. We had Purdue lose at home to Wisconsin on Saturday in a super thrilling matchup that Wisconsin scored 90 points in and played super well in. And so I actually have Purdue down to a 3 seed now, just very narrowly. And Wisconsin potentially up to a 2 seed, still pending some updates to metrics and some review on my part. We also had Kansas go and lose on the road at Utah on Saturday, and so I think they've dropped out of the top 16. But those are just a couple of changes that have happened. Michigan obviously yesterday went on the road and won at Ohio State, and so they may be up to a 3 seed now. But again, very minimal changes. A really solid top 16. I was relatively pleased with the work the committee did. Last year, I felt like there were some inconsistencies in the way that they graded teams. And this year, they've added a couple new metrics that they grade teams on, including number one, your T-Ranketology, which is a predictive metric. And the second is your wins above bubble, or WAB. And to see them lean in a little bit to those couple of new metrics, I think the process has become even more consistent than it has been in the past. And I'm really pleased with where they ended up with the top 16.
Yeah. I've been using Torvik metrics and WAB in specific for like 4 or 5 plus years. So it's great to see the committee catch on. It's been pretty much my like Bible for a while. So that's good. I wanted to talk a little bit before I'll flash your specific bracket up in a second, but I want to stay on this top 16 for a little bit. Kansas, you mentioned them. They're having a notably bad year. I'm assuming after Saturday, they're outside that top 16. You, I think, had them on the 4 line. Bracketology had them 15th. Is this, in your opinion, just predicting the future, the first time Kansas will finish below a 4 seed in the Bill Self era? Because that would be the case if they're not in the top 4.
Yeah, that's a great question. And this was one area that I actually had different than the committee did for the top 16 reveal. And I'm glad, actually, that the committee had them where they did. I predicted that Kansas would get a 3 seed. Okay. And a large part of why I predicted that was based off of a lot of the teams surrounding Kansas didn't do a lot in the non-conference. They played really good teams, but didn't get some of the top-tier wins like Kansas did. Kansas obviously has that neutral court win, a win over Duke. They have the win against Michigan State on a neutral court. They accomplished quite a bit in the non-conference. And I thought that would be graded a little more heavily compared to teams like Arizona, who didn't get a lot done. Their best non-conference win ended up being Samford, actually. They lost a lot of their non-conference games. And I thought the committee would grade Kansas a little bit higher based on what they did in the non-conference. But I was really glad to see that Kansas ended up being a 4 seed, because what it means is that the committee is looking at the resume as a whole. So they're looking at both non-conference and conference. And they graded Kansas pretty harshly based off of their total Q1 opportunities. Right now, they're sitting at 5-7 in Q1 after that loss at Utah on Saturday. And so a sub 500 team in Q1 got a little more heavily penalized than they have in the past. And I think that's actually appropriate. So that was fun to see.
Looking back at the one line, we have Auburn, Florida, Alabama, who would obviously stay there, and Duke. We could all agree the SEC kind of at the top, like that top tier, is pretty interchangeable besides Auburn. I think Auburn, especially even before that over Alabama, but especially afterwards, has just built themselves such a buffer, such a cushion at not only the one line, but the number one overall seed. So, like, how much of a cushion do you think they really have? And on the flip side, how many losses could a team like Duke afford where they're not playing nearly the competition? They don't have nearly the same body of wins.
Yeah, it's a really good question and two very separate conversations. Let's talk about Auburn first. I think with that win at Alabama on Saturday, this team is very near locking up a 1 seed. And I honestly am questioning how close they are to locking up the number 1 overall seed. They are just miles ahead of where anyone else is at in college basketball right now. Now, I won't say that they're 100% locked yet because they still have a couple road mines or land mines on the schedule. They play Arkansas at home this week. They play Georgia at home this week. And those are 2 games that I'm like, okay, if they lose those, maybe it gets a little bit hairy. But those are still good teams that they're playing. It's just not a game that you'd expect them to lose at home. So I think they're very, very close to locking up a number 1 seed. And then we can start talking about, if they are locking up the number 1 overall, which they very well may before the end of the regular season. Second conversation specific to Duke. Duke has been the second best team in college basketball this year. I think Alabama's ranked ahead of them right now. But I think Duke has overall been the better team. I think the resumes, if you compare them side by side, Alabama just has a few more Q1 wins, has a few more higher metrics than Duke has that lead to them being a slight bit ahead right now. But when we talk about Duke locking up a 1 seed and how close they may be to that, they have quite a ways to go, actually. They've got maybe 2 Q1 opportunities for the remainder of the season. And one of those is this Saturday in a non-conference game against Illinois. That should be an absolute thrill. I love when we get these non-conference games in mid to late February. And then at North Carolina to end the season, which will more than likely be a Q1 opportunity if North Carolina stays in the top 75 of the net. Other than that, they play at Virginia, at Miami, home against Florida State, home against Wake Forest, which all are Q2, Q3. I don't think there's any Q4s in there, but Q2, Q3 games. And if you start dropping some of those, it may get close to a seed line drop for them to a 2 seed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a UVA guy, as many of you guys know, and Duke and UVA are playing tonight. Like, I'm not really expecting anything other than a Duke blowout win. The things like that just seem to happen. I mean, UVA has probably their best stretch of games the entire year, or they're like their best, body of work the last 5-6 games, but still, like, I think Duke just kind of runs through and they'll be fine. But it's an interesting conversation because they can't afford 1 or 2 upset losses per se in the same way that the SEC can, just based on how good the teams are. All right, one more question on this top 16. We're going to talk about St. John's. St. John's, they haven't had the most impressive body of wins despite a really good record until recently. They beat Marquette, UConn, and Creighton within the last 4 games. Also, a loss to Villanova is sprinkled into that 4-game stretch, which is notable. But my question to you is, what is St. John's ceiling? Because for context, they have not been a top 4 seed even since 2000. And in that stretch since 2000, they've made the NCAA tournament just 4 times. So this could be a real change to the recent history of the St. John's program.
Absolutely. And I think you said they've made the tournament 4 times since 2000. I don't think they've won a game in that time. So they've never advanced out of the first round since 2000. So this is an awesome experience to see St. John's be good again. and it creates kind of a different type of buzz surrounding college basketball, which I think makes it super fun. I was glad to see that St. John's ended up in the top 16 reveal. Besides some of the, I don't know, challenges in their resume, they are currently 3-4 in Q1. So they are sub 500 in Q1, just like Kansas is. But they are far and away leading the Big East right now. They haven't lost a game outside of Q1, and a couple of their resume metrics would tell you that they're a top 16 team right now, based on the results that they've had. And I think a large part of why they ended up being a top 4 seed on this reveal was that the committee probably took into consideration the margin of their losses. And like I said, they have 4 losses in Q1. Those were by 1 point, another 1 point loss, 3-point loss, and a 2-point loss. So when they lose games, they are not getting blown out whatsoever, like we've seen some of the teams around the 5 line do. And so for me to see St. John's end up being a 4 seed right now, I think is awesome, and good to know that the committee took into account, where their losses were and who they were against. Because again, they haven't lost in a blowout. They haven't lost at home this year. They look really good right now. They look like a team that deserves a protected seed.
On a quick side note, do you think that margin of victory or margin of defeat should matter? Because obviously it's very important in terms of predicting the future, right? How much you lose by and how, like, the process by which the games go. But should it be from a seeding perspective, like a binary, you won, you lost kind of thing, or do you think margin should matter?
No, I think margin should 100% matter, and to what extent it should matter, I think, can be debated, because obviously it's going to affect the metrics that are baked in, both on the predictive side and on the results-based side. Your margin of victory or loss will be baked into those metrics a little bit. But it is good to see that the committee, when they're debating these teams head-to-head, if I'm looking at St. John's versus Marquette right now, Marquette has 5 losses, 2 Q2 losses by 8 points at home to UConn, by 8 points on the road to Dayton. And so those games were a little, I don't want to say blowouts because they're not blowouts, but they were not as close as St. John's losses were, even though Marquette has some of the bigger overall wins. And so for me, I think it's important that the committee considers those things when they're comparing the two teams head-to-head, and say, okay, this team lost against this team, but only by 1 point. Or this team went on the road and played a really competitive game against this team, whereas Team B may not have played competitive games in the non-conference or on the road, whatever it may be.
All right, let's zoom out. Let's talk about the entire bracket here. I got your, I think this was from February 15th before the day, right? So Saturday
Correct.
morning, but definitely a lot of talking points here. I want to start with the ACC, and besides Duke, because we talked about them, but the ACC is, as much as the SEC has been a historically good league for their standards, I think the ACC has been equally bad almost. And I know that's been kind of a trend since 2019 when they had those 3-1 seeds. But what do you think is the floor, and what do you think is the ceiling in terms of number of teams for the ACC? So in your February 15th, I'll tell the listeners what you have. You had Duke on the 1 line, Louisville on the 7 line, Clemson on the 8, Wake as a play in 11, and SMU in the first 4 out. So do you see a world, I guess, where Wake and SMU both don't make it, where they both do make it? Like, what are we thinking in that respect?
Yeah, I think it's certainly more likely that both don't make it than both do make it, especially after Wake Forest's dominant win against SMU on the road on Saturday. I think when we talk about floor and ceiling of the ACC, I think we're pretty much locked in with 3 teams right now. I think Duke, Clemson, and Louisville are all nearly locks, if not already locks, to make the tournament. And I think Wake, if I had to bet on it, I think Wake's going to end up making the tournament, with a relatively light schedule here towards the end, and just really one more Q1 opportunity, if I remember correctly. And so if I had to guess, I would say the floor obviously is going to be 3 teams. Wake Forest fades down the stretch and doesn't make it. The ceiling is going to be 5 teams, but I think it's an incredibly difficult thing for the ACC to get 5 teams in the tournament this year, especially given that SMU is really the only one that has an opportunity to make that 5. And they have not played a competitive game against a tournament opponent. They are getting blown out by an average of like 19 points against anyone that is in the tournament. They've not won a Q1 game. They just don't look like a tournament team, and that has to play some sort of factor into where they stand right now. And so I actually, after that loss against Wake Forest, I dropped SMU like completely out. I think they're under consideration, maybe like the first 10 teams out, but probably team number 10 in that scenario. And it's going to be difficult for them to get back. So again, if I had to bet on it, I think ACC ends up with 4 teams in the tournament. I think Wake Forest will make their way towards in the right direction, I guess, towards Selection Sunday, and we'll end up with those 4 teams in.
For an expanded league with now what, 16 teams or more than that, 18 teams. Yeah, that's a crazy statement to make, but that's just the state of college basketball right now. And I totally agree with you. That's the bottom line there. Next couple of questions are going to be a little bit general, so you kind of could choose what direction you want to take it. But first off, what is a team that is safely in the field right now that you think you could see missing the tournament like in about a month? A team that you just think has a lot less margin for error than people realize, or just you don't believe in them to sustain their success, something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll give you 2 teams, and both of them have kind of faded down the stretch, and so I don't think they're that unreasonable, and I don't think they're actually relatively safe right now. I think they're getting a little more bubbly as the days go on. But West Virginia and Oklahoma are the 2 teams that come to mind when we're talking about teams that were kind of safely in a month ago and are fading down the stretch. And I think the example that I could give is Pitt, right? They were near a top 4 seed at the end of the non-conference, and they have just been a disaster in non-conference play. They've been a disaster since about mid-December. Mm-hmm. And they dropped all the way from being like, oh, this team is going to make the tournament, we're talking about protected seed, to they are nowhere near the bubble right now. And that's kind of what West Virginia and Oklahoma are doing in a smaller scenario. So they're not dropping from protected seed to clear out, but they're stacking up quite a few losses. I think Oklahoma is now 3-9 in SEC play after having a stellar non-conference, and West Virginia is either 500 or sub 500 across the first 3 quadrants now. And so for both of those teams, I think they're good teams, and teams that would be fun to see in March. But the sheer volume of losses that they're picking up here down the stretch is putting them in a little bit of danger in terms of making the tournament or not. So I don't know if we'll end up seeing both of those teams. Oklahoma has a horrible trend year over year of fading out of the tournament towards the end of the season, which makes me really feel for Porter Moser. He's a March icon from what he did at Loyola Chicago, and it would be fun to see him make another tournament and to make a run. But again, those are the 2 teams that I would give you that I think are kind of fading down the stretch and maybe in trouble with the bubble.
Okay, how about the flip side? A team that you think is getting hot or will get hot that jumps into the field that is not currently in right now. I think the biggest one that comes to my mind is obviously Kansas State. You had them in the next 4 out before they recently lost at BYU. However, they over 7 to 10, maybe like 5 to 7 game sample, they've just picked it up so much compared to the non-conference in the beginning of the conference play. So is it Kansas State? Is it a different team? Who do you think gets hot and jumps into the field?
This is a tough one, and I don't think Kansas State is going to end up making it there. They have a very difficult schedule here down the stretch, and super good for them to pick up. I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 Q1 wins in the last couple of weeks to really get into competition for that. But they have a do or die tonight at Utah. If they were to lose that game, it's like all hands off. We're not talking about the bubble anymore. It's over. And I think I would lean towards a team that has a very clean resume with not a lot of Q1 wins. And I think a team that looks like that right now is Indiana. And, you may say, whoa, Indiana, we've been talking all season about a coach that is hated by fans, a team that doesn't look good down the stretch of games. They're blowing home games. They just don't look good. And you're right. But where Indiana sits right now in their quad splits, sorry, let me pull it up on the side here. They have not lost a game outside of Q1. They are 2-11 in Q1, which is obviously horrendous. It's not good. But both of those Q1 wins are on the road at Michigan State, at Ohio State. And so 2 road wins, which is often considered a hurdle that you have to overcome to even make the NCAA tournament. They have that. And they have no losses again outside of Q1. So that provides an opportunity for large leaps here in the coming weeks if you're able to go and win some of those Q1 games where you don't have the bad losses that are kind of holding you back on the schedule. And so Indiana's got a Q1 opportunity against Purdue at home. They are going to have a Q1 opportunity at Oregon, a game that will likely be near Q1 against Ohio State at home to end the season. And I think those 3 opportunities, if you can see them realize a couple Q1 wins there, they could get very close to the bubble and end up making the tournament, which would be awfully weird given the fact that it's Mike Woodson's final year and he's faced so much criticism.
Yeah. All right, let's go out west to end this show. I want to first talk about the West Coast Conference with Gonzaga and St. Mary's. How much leeway do both of these teams have in the WCC? You had Gonzaga at the 9 line. Recently, you had St. Mary's on the 8 line.
Yeah, I think St. Mary's is relatively safe now. I'd consider them a lock to make the tournament. I don't think that they have enough opportunities to fade down the stretch where they're going to miss the tournament. So let's talk about Gonzaga. Very weird year for this team. And perhaps in March we're talking about them making their 12th or 13th straight Sweet 16. I guess not that many.
Yeah.
They've consistently made the Sweet 16 every year after year. And last year we were having the conversation mid-February about them not being a good team and not making the Sweet 16 and breaking that streak, and then they did it anyway. But this year started awesome. They got a lot of guys back. They went and manhandled Baylor in their first game of the season, just absolutely throttled them by a score of 101-63. And then played a very clean non-conference, beat San Diego State, beat Arizona State, beat Indiana, narrowly lost to Kentucky, narrowly lost to UConn. It looked like this was going to be a team that we were talking about being a contender for a top seed come March. And then they stacked up a couple bad conference losses against Oregon State, against Santa Clara. They lost to St. Mary's, which, that's not a bad loss, but it's a team that they usually beat. And so they've got a couple good games down the stretch that I'll be paying very close attention to. Their final 3 of the season are St. Mary's at home, at Santa Clara, a team they already lost to, and at San Francisco, who's a good team. And I think if they were to end that stretch 1-2 or 0-3, we're talking about bubble Gonzaga, which would feel awfully weird.
And then you knew I was going to ask you this at some point. Everybody wants the possibility of a 2-bid Big West. UC San Diego and UC Irvine being those 2 teams. You have UC San Diego as a 12 seed in your latest bracketology, which I would assume indicates you think they win the conference tournament. And then UC Irvine is in your first 4 out. Is it possible in any way, any realistic way, that both of them could get in?
Yeah, absolutely. It's possible. It's going to be, I don't know, it's going to be a stretch towards the end of the year. And probably what would have to happen, I think UC San Diego has the better at-large case right now than UC Irvine. And so what it would probably have to involve is both teams winning out to the conference championship and then Irvine beating UC San Diego in the conference championship, where UC San Diego stacks up enough wins to get to maybe the bubble and it'd be a last team in that plays in Dayton, and UC Irvine obviously being the automatic qualifier in that scenario.
And then last question I want to ask you, you follow mid-major basketball really deeply. And is there just like a storyline or 2 that has caught your eye that we should monitor heading into conference tournament season, like a specific conference tournament or 2 that you're going to really keep your eye on because there's a team or 2 that you really like?
Yeah, there is. There's a couple of those. I'm going to have my eye really close on the A10 tournament. I
Okay.
think George Mason has been a fun team this year. They're currently sitting at 20-5. Just had a massive come from behind victory on Saturday to pick up another Q3 win and avoid a loss in that scenario. Um, they they look like they could get an at-large bid if they were to close the season with enough wins to then lose the conference championship and end up with an at-large bid. VCU is also really close to that, and I think Dayton as well had a great start to the year and has been pretty bad in conference play, but I think they have a good team. And so there's a handful of teams in that A10 tournament that are awfully intriguing to me that I could see winning that conference tournament. I think it'll be awfully competitive. Um, and I guess not only those three teams, you've had St. Joe's that's looked good this year. You've had Rhode Island that's looked good for stretches this year. St. Bonaventure has looked good for stretches this year. And so for me, it's going to be an entertaining conference tournament of who comes up and steps up to the plate when the big games are on and the lights are on. Excited to see that tournament. I think another one that I'm excited about is the American Conference and seeing what happens in that conference tournament. Obviously, I think there's a relatively good chance that we have a bid stealer from the American. You have Memphis, who's nearly a lock for the tournament, who's playing games very closely with some of those teams in the American Conference, and it just tripped him up yesterday, losing to Wichita State on the road. So I think there's a relatively good chance again that we could end up with a bid stealer in that league, and it'll be an awfully entertaining conference tournament if Memphis goes down to see who that bid stealer is going to be and whose bid they're going to steal from the bubble.
Yeah, those are two good answers. In terms of one bid leagues, I'm locking into the MAC, the MAAC. I think there's a few intriguing teams there, especially a couple teams that we haven't really seen in the tournament, specifically Merrimack and Marist. So I'm going to try to get to that tournament since I live in the Northeast area, wherever it may be. I think that one's in Atlantic City, New Jersey, I believe.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to try to get down there for at least a couple rounds, but yeah, that will do it for today's edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. Appreciate you guys for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our channel here on YouTube. Be sure to follow us on the socials at CBB Review on X/Twitter and Instagram. But once again, that will do it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and take care.